The town of Millbrook woke slowly, as it always did, wrapped in a quiet that felt older than the roads that cut through it. Morning light filtered through oak-lined streets, settling gently against storefront windows and church steeples as if reluctant to disturb anything too quickly. By 7:30, the same shopkeepers unlocked the same doors, the same retirees claimed their usual tables at the same diner, and the same patrol car rolled steadily down Main Street with clockwork precision. Officer John Harris drove that patrol car. He had driven these streets for nearly 20 years now, long enough to know which houses left their porch lights on overnight, which intersections caught the worst of the winter ice, which kids would try to sneak cigarettes behind the baseball field after dark. There was comfort in that predictability, in the rhythm of a place that rarely changed. Millbrook didn't ask much of its people beyond quiet loyalty and routine, and John had given, both in abundance. From the outside, he was exactly what the town believed him to be: reliable, steady, the kind of man who showed up when things went wrong and stayed until they were right again. He waved politely at Mrs. Thompson as she arranged flowers in her front display window, his expression softening just enough to be called friendly. He stopped for a pedestrian before they even stepped into the crosswalk. He drove the speed limit even when no one else bothered. Dependable. That was the word they used most often. But dependable didn't mean approachable. John rarely lingered in conversation. He didn't attend town picnics anymore or join his colleagues for drinks after a late shift. When someone asked how he was doing, he offered the same brief nod and a quiet, "Can't complain," before moving on. There was nothing unkind in it, just a firm boundary drawn so naturally that most people had stopped noticing it altogether. 10 years earlier, he hadn't been this way. 10 years earlier, there had been laughter in his house. Now, the front door opened onto silence. The home he returned to at the end of each shift was neat to the point of sterility. Every object precisely where it had been the night before. The couch cushions were never disturbed. The kitchen counters held only what was necessary: a coffee maker, a drying rack, a bowl of fruit that was replaced before it had the chance to spoil. In the evenings, he reheated the same simple dinners: grilled chicken, canned vegetables, rice, and ate them alone at the small table meant for four. The second bedroom remained closed. It had once been intended for something else, for someone else. He didn't open that door anymore. Sometimes when the house settled in the quiet hours after midnight, it almost sounded as though it was waiting, like a place paused between breaths, unsure whether to exhale or hold on a little longer. The photographs that still lined the hallway bore witness to a life that had never quite begun. Smiling vacations, holiday dinners, the soft promise of future plans that had ended abruptly with a phone call on a rain-slick highway. 10 years ago, Sarah had wanted children. They had talked about it endlessly in the months before the accident: names, schools, whether they'd need to move somewhere with a bigger yard. John had imagined bedtime stories and scraped knees and the echo of footsteps racing down the hall. Now, there were only echoes of his own. Millbrook respected him, trusted him, relied on him, but no one really knew him anymore. And as Officer John Harris moved through the quiet patterns of his days patrolling familiar roads, locking his door at the same time each night, existing in a life carefully emptied of surprise, there was no reason to believe that anything ever would, until the call came. By the time the call came in, the sky over Millbrook had already begun to darken into that muted gray that made every house look the same, and every shadow stretch just a little too far. John had been halfway through his shift, parked near the edge of Maple Street where the town gave way to overgrown lots and half-forgotten rental homes that landlords stopped caring about years ago. The engine idled beneath him, a low steady hum that blended into the quiet of late afternoon. He was writing up a minor traffic report, the kind that required more paperwork than urgency, when the radio crackled sharply to life. All units, respond to a welfare check at 1456 Elm Street. Possible child abandonment. Neighbors report unusual activity. Proceed with caution. There was something about the dispatcher's tone, tight, measured, that made John's hand pause over the page. Child abandonment wasn't common in Millbrook. Neglect, sometimes. Custody disputes that spilled into shouting matches loud enough for the neighbors to call it in. But abandonment, that was different. That carried a finality to it that the town wasn't used to seeing. John reached for the mic. Unit 12 en route. He didn't turn the siren on. The road to Elm Street was narrow and uneven, lined with sagging chain-link fences and mailboxes that leaned as though they were trying to escape their own foundations. As he drove, the town shifted around him, the tidy lawns of Main Street replaced by knee-high weeds, bright porch lights giving way to boarded windows and peeling paint. 1456 sat at the end of a short gravel drive, its shutters hanging crooked against weathered siding that had once been white. One of the downstairs windows was covered with a sheet instead of curtains, the fabric moving faintly in the breeze like a signal flag. John stepped out of the cruiser slowly, the crunch of gravel under his boots louder than it should have been. The front yard was empty, no toys, no bikes, no sign that children had ever lived there at all. But as he approached the door, he heard it, crying, soft at first, thin, uncertain but unmistakable. The sound came from somewhere deep inside the house, rising and falling in uneven waves as though whoever made it had been trying not to for a long time. John knocked. "Police department," he called, his voice steady but firm. "Is anyone home?" The crying stopped. For a moment, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Then came the sound of something shifting, footsteps, maybe a whisper, another smaller voice. Frightened and hushed, he knocked again, louder this time. When no one answered, he tried the handle. It turned easily beneath his hand. The air inside the house was stale, tinged with the faint sourness of something left too long unattended. Dishes sat in the sink beneath a film of cloudy water. A half-open cabinet revealed empty shelves. The living room held little more than a worn sofa, and a television with its screen cracked along one corner, and in the farthest corner of the room, pressed tightly together, as though they could disappear into one another if they tried hard enough, were 6 girls. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12. She stood slightly in front of the others, her posture rigid with a kind of determination that didn't belong on someone her age. Behind her, a girl with braided hair clutched a paperback book to her chest. Another wiped at her face with the sleeve of an oversized shirt. 2 younger ones held hands, their wide eyes fixed on John's uniform, and at the very center of them, all barely visible beneath a blanket too large for her small frame, was a toddler whose quiet sobs seemed to fill the entire room. No one spoke. John felt something in his chest tighten in a way he hadn't experienced in years, sharp and sudden, and impossible to ignore. "It's okay," he said finally, lowering himself to one knee so he wouldn't tower over them. "You're not in trouble. I'm here to help." The oldest girl's gaze didn't waver. "They're not coming back," she said, her voice thin but certain. A beat of silence followed. "Who's not coming back?" John asked gently. "Our mom and dad." The words landed like a weight. "They left for days ago," she continued, her chin lifting slightly as though daring him to argue. "There was an accident. Someone came to tell us. They said somebody would come get us after." Her voice faltered then, just enough to reveal the fear beneath it. But nobody did. John didn't realize how tightly he'd been holding his breath until he let it out. Behind him, the radio crackled again, back up asking for confirmation, but he didn't answer right away. He was still looking at the 6 small figures huddled together in a house that had already begun to forget them. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought began to form. It was quiet at first, unreasonable, impossible, and it refused to go away. The first night passed in a blur of fluorescent lights and unanswered questions. By the time John left the house on Elm Street, Child Protective Services had already been notified. A social worker arrived within the hour, her face drawn tight with the kind of concern that came from seeing too many situations like this, and knowing exactly how they ended. The girls were escorted out one by one, their few belongings stuffed into plastic bags that crinkled too loudly in the quiet. The youngest refused to let go of the oldest girl's hand. John watched from the porch as they were loaded into the back of a county van. Not in restraints, not like criminals, but the effect felt the same all the same. 6 small figures being transported somewhere unknown because the world had run out of space for them. He told himself this was procedure. He told himself they'd be safer this way still. As the van pulled away and disappeared down the gravel road, something twisted sharply in his chest that he couldn't quite name. Back at the station, the paperwork began almost immediately. Names, dates of birth, medical histories that no one had, family contacts that didn't exist. John sat in on the preliminary report, while the lead social worker Linda Chavez outlined the situation in clipped, professional tones. Both parents were killed in a multi-vehicle collision on Highway 47. She explained, sliding a file across the table. No extended family has come forward. We've reached out to every emergency contact listed. Nothing. John skimmed the report, the words blurring together until one line caught his attention. Recommendation: immediate separation due to placement limitations. He looked up. What does that mean? He asked. Linda hesitated, just long enough to make the answer clear before she said it out loud. It means we don't have a foster home equipped to take all 6, she replied quietly. They'll have to be placed individually, maybe in pairs if we're lucky. The room felt smaller suddenly. They just lost their parents, John said. You're going to split them up too. Her expression softened, but the firmness in her voice didn't waver. We don't have a choice. Officer Harris, it's not ideal, but it's the best we can do under the circumstances. The best we can do. John leaned back in his chair, the words echoing in his mind long after the conversation moved on to logistics and timelines. He thought of the way the girls had stood together in that corner, forming a tight, protective circle like they were the only thing keeping each other from falling apart. He thought of the toddler buried beneath that blanket. He thought of the oldest, Amara. He remembered now, trying to sound braver than she felt. They're not coming back. Hours later, he found himself parked outside the temporary foster facility where the girls had been taken for the night. The building was quiet, its windows glowing softly against the dark. Inside, he knew they were being processed, assigned beds, issued toiletries, given instructions about lights out and meal schedules. Somewhere in there, someone was probably explaining that they wouldn't all be waking up in the same place much longer. John didn't remember deciding to get out of the car. He just knew that one minute he was sitting behind the wheel, and the next he was standing on the sidewalk, staring at the entrance like it might offer answers if he looked long enough. A nurse at the front desk recognized him from earlier and gave a polite nod. They're settled in for the night, she said. You can come back tomorrow if you need to ask them anything else. Tomorrow. By tomorrow, the process would already be underway. Files transferred, homes assigned. The slow dismantling of the only family those girls had left. John swallowed hard. Is the social worker still here? He asked. Linda was in one of the back offices, reviewing intake forms under the harsh glare of a desk lamp. She looked up as he entered, surprise flickering briefly across her features. Officer Harris, is everything all right? He didn't sit down. What if they didn't have to be separated? He said. She blinked. I'm sorry. What if someone took them all? He clarified, his voice rougher now. Together. Linda studied him carefully, as though trying to decide whether she'd heard correctly. That would require an approved guardian with the resources to house and support 6 children. She replied slowly, it's not something we can arrange overnight. I'm not asking you to arrange it, John said. Silence settled between them, heavy and disbelieving. Officer, she began, her tone cautious now. Adoption, especially of this scale, isn't something you can volunteer for on impulse. It's a long process. Home studies, financial evaluations, cultural considerations. I know. He didn't know. Not really. But he knew what would happen if he walked away. Linda leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in front of her. You're a single man, she said. You work full-time in law enforcement. These are 6 young girls who have experienced a significant trauma. They will need stability, patience, a support system that... I have a house, John interrupted quietly. That's not the same thing as a home. The words hit harder than he expected. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then John exhaled slowly. I can't let them grow up thinking the world only knows how to take things from them, he said. Not when I'm standing right here. Linda's gaze didn't leave his face. Outside, The hallway lights dimmed as the facility prepared for the night. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed softly. The decision, once spoken aloud, felt irreversible and far more terrifying than anything he'd faced in the line of duty. No one in Millbrook slept easily that night. Word traveled fast in a town that small, faster than official reports, faster than press releases, faster even than the quiet assurances of the system that everything would be handled properly. By sunrise, half the community already knew that Officer John Harris had done something no one quite understood. He had asked to adopt 6 girls who weren't his. Inside the county office the next morning, the air felt thicker than usual. Conversations lowered when he passed. Chairs shifted. A few officers offered polite nods that carried more confusion than respect. Sergeant Mike Peterson caught up with him near the lockers. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and concern. "Tell me it's not true," Mike said quietly. John didn't answer right away. He finished fastening the last button on his uniform, his movements slow and deliberate. "They're going to split them up," he said finally. Mike let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "That's what the system does," he replied. "It's not right, but it's how it works. You can't just..." "John, that's 6 kids. 6. You don't even know if you'll get approved." John turned to face him then, something hard and unyielding settling behind his eyes. "I know what happens to kids who get separated," he said. "You've seen it too." Mike didn't argue with that. They both had. Too many times. Still, he shook his head. "This isn't like taking in a stray dog, Harris. This is the rest of your life." John didn't need the reminder. He felt it in the silence waiting for him. When he unlocked his front door that evening, the same silence that had greeted him every night. For 10 years, only now it seemed louder, almost expectant, as though the house itself had heard the rumors and was bracing for something it didn't know how to hold. He walked through each room slowly. The living room, where nothing ever moved. The kitchen, where only one plate ever needed washing. The hallway with its neatly arranged photographs of a future that had never come. When he reached the second bedroom, he stopped. The door was still closed. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, his hand hovering inches from the handle. Behind it was a space that had been meant for something else. Paint samples still tucked into a drawer, a folded crib manual he had never thrown away. Deferred plans, deferred dreams, a life interrupted before it could begin. He opened the door. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beam of late afternoon sunlight that spilled across the floor. The room was empty save for a box in the corner, its contents untouched for a decade. John stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight, and tried to imagine what it would look like filled with bunk beds and scattered toys, and the sound of voices that weren't his own. 6 voices, 6 lives that would depend on him to make this space something more than what it had been. His chest tightened. Later that week, the home study began. Inspectors moved through the house with professional detachment, measuring square footage, checking smoke detectors, noting the absence of hazards. Questions followed about his income, his schedule, his support network, about whether he understood the responsibility he was proposing to take on. Children who have experienced trauma require specialized care, one evaluator told him. They may struggle with attachment, with trust, with anger. John nodded. "They will," he said, "and you'll be raising them in a community where they may feel different." He thought of Maple Street, of the way neighbors sometimes watched from behind curtains when something unfamiliar passed by. "I know," the evaluator hesitated before continuing. "There will also be cultural considerations," she added carefully. "Transracial adoption can present unique challenges. Are you prepared to address their identity needs as they grow older?" John didn't answer immediately. Prepared wasn't the right word, but willing was. "I'll learn," he said at last. Across town, the girls remained in temporary placement, unaware of how precarious their future still was. The system moved slowly even when urgency demanded otherwise. Paperwork piled up. Background checks crawled through bureaucratic channels. And in quiet offices behind closed doors, decisions were being debated that would determine whether those 6 sisters would remain together or become strangers by the end of the month. John waited. He waited through interviews and inspections, through whispered speculation at the diner and raised eyebrows at the station. He waited through nights that felt longer than they had in years, his thoughts circling the same impossible question. What if they said no? Because if they did, if the system decided he wasn't enough, then everything he had begun to imagine for those girls would vanish before it ever had the chance to exist. And this time, there would be no siren he could turn on to make it right. The waiting was the worst part. John had faced armed suspects, domestic disputes that turned violent without warning, and more late-night emergencies than he could count. But none of them had ever left him as powerless as this. At least in the field, there was always something he could do, a door to kick in, a voice to raise, a life to pull back from the edge. Here, there was only paperwork. Days bled into weeks, each one measured not by patrol routes or shift changes, but by the sound of the phone not ringing every time it buzzed. His pulse jumped only to settle again when it turned out to be dispatch or Mike, or a reminder about some community meeting he had no intention of attending. At the foster facility, the girls had begun asking questions. He knew this because Linda called one afternoon, her voice gentler than it had been the night they first spoke. "They're trying to be brave," she said quietly, "but they know something's happening. The older one, Amara, keeps asking if you're still coming back." John gripped the edge of his kitchen counter until his knuckles whitened. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," Linda replied, "that you're trying. It didn't feel like enough." That night, he drove past the facility again. He didn't go inside this time. Visitation hours had already ended, but he sat across the street, with the engine off, staring at the rows of identical windows on the second floor. Somewhere behind one of them, 6 sisters were sleeping in borrowed beds, knowing that any day now they might wake up in different houses, separated not because they wanted to be, but because no one had wanted all of them. A flicker of movement caught his eye. One of the curtains shifted slightly, and for just a second, he thought he saw a small silhouette standing at the glass, watching, waiting. He told himself it wasn't possible, that it was just his imagination, but he stayed. Another 10 minutes anyway. The next morning, the call finally came. "Officer Harris," the voice on the line said, "this is the County Placement Committee. We'd like you to come in this afternoon to discuss the status of your application." Status, not approval. John arrived early, his uniform pressed to perfection even though he'd taken the day off to be there. The conference room was smaller than he expected, just a long table, a pitcher of water, and 3 people seated with files spread neatly in front of them. Linda was one of them. The others introduced themselves quickly: evaluators, supervisors, decision-makers whose signatures would determine whether 6 girls remained a family or became 6 separate case numbers in 6 separate systems. They asked about his finances again, his schedule, his plans for childcare during overnight shifts. "How do you intend to provide emotional support for children who have just experienced a significant loss?" One of them asked. "I'll be there," he said. "That may not be sufficient," another replied. "Have you considered counseling services, cultural mentorship programs, community integration resources?" He nodded. "Yes, and what happens?" The first evaluator continued. "If one or more of the children struggles to bond with you." John thought of the way they had stood together in that corner of the house, 6 pairs of eyes locked on his badge, searching for something they weren't sure existed. "I won't give up on them," he said simply. There was a pause, a glance exchanged between the committee members that he couldn't quite read. "Officer Harris," Linda said carefully, "we need to be certain that this decision isn't being made out of guilt or grief. Children deserve permanence, not a temporary solution to someone else's pain." The words landed harder than any accusation. For a moment, John didn't speak. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice low but steady. "I know what it feels like to lose your family," he said. "I know what it feels like to wake up one day and realize the life you planned is gone. If I can keep that from happening to them again even just once, then this isn't about me at all." Silence settled over the room. Outside, somewhere down the hall, a phone rang. Finally, one of the evaluators closed the file in front of her. "We'll need time to deliberate," she said. "Time," John nodded, though the word felt like a weight. pressing down on his chest. As he stood to leave, Linda caught his eye. There was something different in her expression now, not certainty, not yet, but something closer to hope. It was more than he'd had yesterday, and maybe, just maybe, enough to keep 6 sisters from being torn apart. 3 days passed before the decision came. 3 days of silence that stretched longer than any night shift John had ever worked. He found himself checking his phone between traffic stops, during paperwork, even at red lights, like the outcome might somehow arrive faster if he was ready for it. It didn't. When the call finally came, it was just after noon, the kind of quiet midday hour when most of Millbrook settled into routine, when nothing unexpected ever seemed to happen. "Officer Harris," Linda's voice said through the receiver, calm but carrying something beneath it. "The committee has reached a decision. We'd like you to come down." She didn't say congratulations. She didn't say anything at all about approval, and somehow, that made the drive feel longer than it should have been. The same conference room waited for him when he arrived, same table, same files, same 3 people seated with expressions that gave nothing away. Linda stood when he entered, but she didn't smile. John remained standing this time. One of the evaluators cleared her throat. "Officer Harris," she began, folding her hands neatly in front of her, "after reviewing your application, conducting the home study, and assessing the needs of the children involved, we've come to a conclusion regarding your request for guardianship." His pulse roared in his ears. "You are aware that placement of 6 minors into a single-parent household is unconventional." He nodded. "And you understand that approval would be contingent upon ongoing supervision and compliance with recommended support services." Another nod. The pause that followed felt deliberate, as though they were measuring not just his reaction, but his resolve. Finally, she slid a folder across the table toward him. "We are prepared to approve your application for provisional placement." For a moment, John didn't move, didn't breathe. "Prepared. Provisional." Words that weren't quite final but weren't rejection either. He opened the folder slowly, the pages inside outlining terms and conditions in language so formal it almost seemed unreal. Mandatory counseling sessions, cultural competency workshops, monthly home visits, financial disclosures. Requirements. Expectations. Proof that someone, somewhere, believed he could do this. Across the table, Linda finally allowed herself a small smile. "They can come home with you tomorrow," she said softly. "Home." The word landed heavier than anything else that afternoon. The next day moved faster than he expected. There were final signatures to provide, car seats to install, emergency contact forms to complete. Someone handed him a packet labeled Transitional Placement Guidelines, another with information on trauma-informed parenting. He signed everything. At the facility, the girls were waiting in the common room when he arrived. 6 small figures seated close together on a worn couch, their belongings once again packed into plastic bags. Amara was the first to notice him. She didn't run forward, didn't smile, just stood there, her posture straightening as though bracing for something she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. John knelt in front of them, suddenly aware of how loud his own heartbeat sounded in the quiet. "I made a promise," he said. "Remember?" The younger ones looked at each other uncertainly. Amara didn't blink. "Well," he continued, forcing a steadiness into his voice that he didn't quite feel yet, "I talked to some people, and if you want to, you can all come live with me." Silence. Then the smallest one, Jasmine, tilted her head slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "All of us." John nodded. "All of you." The change was immediate. Hope, fragile but unmistakable, flickered across 6 faces that had learned not to expect good news. Zoe clutched her book tighter to her chest. Leela reached for Tiana's hand. Simone's eyes filled with tears she didn't seem to realize were there. And Amara, brave, guarded Amara, finally exhaled. The drive back to his house was quieter than he'd imagined it would be. The girls spoke in hushed tones, their voices threaded with disbelief, as though they were afraid saying too much might make it disappear. John gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing ahead to everything that would come next. Beds to build. Meals to cook. Fears to soothe. Questions he wouldn't always know how to answer. As he pulled into the driveway and cut the engine, The silence that followed felt different from the one he'd left that morning. This time, it wasn't empty. It was waiting. For a long moment after the engine shut off, no one moved. The house sat in front of them exactly as it always had, still, orderly, untouched by anything unpredictable. Its windows reflected the late afternoon sun with the same quiet indifference they had for the past 10 years, as though unaware that everything inside was about to change. John opened his door first. The sound seemed louder than usual. Behind him, he heard the soft click of another seatbelt unfastening, then another. One by one, the girls climbed out of the cruiser, their small plastic bags clutched tightly in their hands like shields. They didn't speak as they followed him up the short walkway. Their footsteps were careful, measured like visitors entering a place they weren't sure they were allowed to belong. At the front door, John hesitated. His hand hovered over the handle for just a second longer than necessary. 10 years of routine lived on the other side of that door, 10 years of silence and untouched furniture and carefully preserved absence. He turned the knob. The house greeted them with the faint scent of lemon cleaner and something older beneath it. The air felt still, as though it had been holding its breath for years and wasn't quite ready to let go. The girls stepped inside slowly. Jasmine stayed close to Amara's side, her fingers gripping the hem of her sister's shirt. Simone's eyes moved quickly, cataloging everything: the couch, the framed photos, the narrow hallway that led deeper into the house. Zoe clutched her book so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Tiana was the only one who moved forward without hesitation. She took 2 steps into the living room, her gaze settling on the photographs lining the wall. Smiling faces caught mid-laughter. A woman with bright eyes and wine-tousled hair leaning into John's shoulder. She didn't ask who it was. She already knew. Behind them, the door clicked shut. The sound echoed. John cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how large the silence felt, now that it was shared. "All right," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Let me show you around." The tour was brief: living room, kitchen, bathroom. But when they reached the hallway, he stopped in front of the closed bedroom door at the end, the one he hadn't opened in years. The girls watched him, waiting. He reached for the handle and pushed it open. Dust motes swirled in the beam of light that spilled across the empty floor. The room was bare except for a few forgotten boxes in the corner, remnants of a plan that had never been realized. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Leela stepped inside. Her footsteps were soft against the wood as she turned slowly in a circle, taking in the space with wide, curious eyes. "Is this ours?" she asked. John swallowed. "It will be," he replied. That night, the house sounded different. Water ran where it hadn't before, multiple faucets turning on and off in uneven rhythms. The soft creak of floorboards carried footsteps that weren't his own. Whispered voices drifted through the hallway long after bedtime, punctuated by the occasional muffled giggle that felt almost out of place against the quiet. John lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling. Every new sound made his chest tighten, not with fear, but with the sudden weight of responsibility that came with knowing those voices depended on him now. 6 lives, 6 futures, 6 fragile hearts that had already been broken once. Down the hall, a door opened. He sat up. A moment later, there was a soft knock. It was Amara. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral in a way that didn't quite hide the uncertainty beneath it. "They said we might not get to stay together," she said quietly. John didn't answer right away. "They said we'd probably have to go to different houses." Her voice wavered then, just slightly. "But you promised." He met her gaze. "I know." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, she nodded once, as though filing the answer away for later, and turned to leave. But before she reached the door, she paused. "What if they changed their mind?" she asked without looking back. The question lingered long after she disappeared down the hallway, and for the first time since bringing them home, John realized something he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. Approval had only been provisional, meaning the system could still take them away. The word provisional began to haunt him. It showed up in the paperwork stacked neatly on his kitchen counter, in the monthly visit schedule taped to the refrigerator, in the polite but firm tone of every caseworker who reminded him gently, Professionally, that nothing about this placement was permanent yet. The girls were home, but they weren't his, not officially. And at any moment, if something went wrong, if someone decided he wasn't fit, if one report came back unfavorable, if even one of them showed signs of distress severe enough to raise concern, the system could reverse everything. They could be taken. The first visit came sooner than expected. John had barely begun assembling the bunk beds when there was a knock at the door. One Thursday afternoon, the girls were in the living room, sprawled across the floor with coloring books someone from the church had dropped off earlier that day. Simone looked up as he passed by. "Who is it?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Through the peephole, he saw Linda standing beside another woman he didn't recognize, clipboard in hand. Expression unreadable. Inspection. He opened the door. "Good afternoon, Officer Harris," the woman said as she stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Her eyes moved quickly. Walls, floors, furniture, cataloging everything with clinical precision. "We're here for your first placement review." The girls had gone quiet behind him. Jasmine shifted closer to Amara, her small fingers curling into the older girl's sleeve. Zoe closed her book slowly, as though afraid the sound might matter. The woman made notes as she moved through the house. "Sleeping arrangements?" she asked. John gestured toward the hallway. She inspected the room carefully, counting beds, checking spacing, testing the window latch. Her pen scratched steadily across the page, each mark sounding louder than it should have in the silence. "And schooling? They start Monday. Counseling sessions scheduled for next week." She nodded once, but didn't look convinced. In the kitchen, she paused beside the refrigerator. "You're aware that maintaining sibling placement requires demonstration of emotional stability across all parties involved," she said, flipping to another page. "Trauma responses may manifest unpredictably." John felt his jaw tighten. "They're adjusting," he replied, as if summoned by the word. A voice rose from the living room, sharp, frightened. "No." The sound cut through the house like glass. By the time John reached the doorway, he saw Tiana standing in the center of the room, her fists clenched at her sides. One of the coloring books lay crumpled at her feet, pages torn where she must have grabbed it to hard. "I don't want to go back," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I'm not leaving them." Jasmine had begun to cry. The evaluator appeared behind him. "Has she exhibited similar outbursts before?" she asked quietly. John didn't answer. Tiana's breathing came fast now, uneven. Her eyes darted from him to the stranger in the kitchen, panic widening them with every second. "They're here to take us," she said, backing away. "You said we could stay together." John stepped forward slowly. "No one's taking you anywhere," he said, keeping his voice low, but she didn't seem to hear him. The room felt suddenly too small, too fragile. One incident, one moment of fear twisted into something else. The evaluator's pen hovered over her clipboard. Behind Tiana, Amara moved quickly, wrapping an arm around her sister's shoulders and pulling her close. The younger girl's protests softened into sobs, her anger collapsing beneath the weight of something deeper. Loss, the kind that didn't leave quietly. When the visit finally ended, the house seemed to sag with relief. Linda lingered at the door. "She's scared," John said, before she could speak. "I know. They all are." Linda's gaze softened. "This is exactly why the review process exists," she replied gently. "We need to be certain this environment is the right one for them, right? Safe, stable, permanent." John nodded, but the knot in his chest didn't loosen. As the door closed behind her, he turned back toward the living room, toward the 6 girls who had begun to unpack pieces of their lives into his house, uncertain whether they'd be allowed to keep them there. Provisional meant they still belonged to the system, and the system was always watching. By the end of the first month, the house no longer sounded like silence. It sounded like survival. Drawers opened and closed at all hours. Someone was always running water. The floorboards groaned beneath small, restless footsteps that rarely stopped moving for long. Laughter came in short bursts, unexpected, fragile before vanishing just as quickly when someone remembered. They weren't supposed to feel safe yet, but safety wasn't something any of them trusted, not completely. The girls had begun school that week. Millbrook Elementary had never seen a family quite like theirs walk through its doors before. 6 black sisters stepping into a building where nearly every face that turned toward them was white. Teachers greeted them with smiles that didn't always reach their eyes. Other students whispered behind cupped hands, and when John picked them up that first afternoon, he noticed how quiet they were. Zoe stared out the window without speaking. Simone kept her backpack clutched tightly in her lap. Even Leela, who had asked a dozen questions on the drive there that morning, didn't say a word. It wasn't until they reached home that Tiana finally broke the silence. "They asked if you were our real dad," she said, her voice flat. John felt something twist sharply inside his chest. "What did you tell them?" he asked. "That you're the one who brought us here, not the one who kept them." That night, he found Amara in the kitchen long after the others had gone to bed. She stood on a chair, reaching for a glass on the highest shelf with careful determination. "You could have asked for help," he said quietly. She didn't look at him. "If I asked too much," she replied. "People get tired." The words landed harder than anything she could have shouted. Later, when the house finally settled into an uneasy sleep, John sat at the kitchen table with the placement report spread open in front of him. Mandatory counseling had already begun. Community integration sessions were scheduled for the following week. He was doing everything they asked, everything required, but the margin for error felt razor thin. 3 nights later, the call came from Simone's school. He arrived to find her seated outside the principal's office, her eyes red and swollen from crying. The teacher who stood beside her looked uncomfortable, like someone who had stumbled into a situation they didn't quite understand. "There was an incident during recess," she explained. "Another student made a comment that, well." Simone responded physically. Simone didn't deny it. She said, "We weren't supposed to be here." She whispered, her voice barely audible, "that nobody wanted us before." John closed his eyes. The principal outlined disciplinary policy with practice neutrality, 0 tolerance, suspension pending review. "And the other student?" he asked. "She'll be spoken to." "As well, spoken to." Simone's shoulders trembled beside him. Back in the parking lot, she didn't wait for him to open the car door before asking the question that mattered most. "Are they going to send us away now?" He turned to her, the weight of it pressing down in ways he hadn't anticipated. "No," he said firmly, but the truth was he didn't know. That evening, the house felt different again. Not loud this time, tense. The girls stayed close together in the living room, as though proximity might protect them from something they couldn't see yet. Jasmine refused to let go of Leela's hand. Zoe kept glancing toward the front door every time a car passed outside, waiting for another knock, another clipboard, another decision made in a room they'd never see. John stood in the hallway, listening to their whispered voices drift through the open doorway. "We can't mess up," Amara said softly. "Not even once, because one mistake, one outburst, one fight on a playground could be all it took to prove that keeping them together had been a mistake. And mistakes, the system believed, were best corrected early, before attachments had time to grow too strong to break. Winter came early that year. By the time the first frost settled over Millbrook, the Harris house had begun to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like something, alive, something, trying, cautiously, to become a home. Shoes gathered near the front door in mismatched pairs. Homework spread across the kitchen table long after dinner. Someone had taped a crooked drawing to the refrigerator with more pride than skill. But even as routines formed, the fear never left. It lived in the way Jasmine still woke up crying some nights, her small voice calling out to sisters who had never once slept in separate rooms. It showed itself in Simone's hesitation before raising her hand in class, in Zoe's habit of packing her backpack the night before just in case she had to leave quickly, and in Amara, it was quieter. She didn't ask questions anymore, which, somehow, was worse. The second review visit came on a Tuesday evening without warning. John was in the garage, assembling another dresser, when the knock sounded at the front door. Not loud, not urgent. Just official. The girls froze before he even opened it. Linda stood on the porch again, this time with a man in a dark overcoat whose expression suggested He'd already made up his mind about something. Evening, Officer Harris, Linda said softly. This is Mr. Keating from the Placement Oversight Board. Oversight. John stepped aside to let them in. Keating didn't bother with pleasantries. His gaze moved quickly from the living room to the hallway, taking in every detail with clinical detachment. We received a report from Millbrook Elementary, he said, flipping open a folder, regarding a physical altercation involving one of the minors in your care. Simone's breath caught behind him. John felt it without turning around. It was addressed. He replied evenly. She's been attending counseling as scheduled. Mr. Keating nodded once, but didn't look convinced. Behavioral incidents so soon after placement can indicate adjustment difficulties, he continued, particularly in cases where trauma responses may compromise household stability. Household stability. Behind him, he heard Jasmine begin to whimper. Emra's voice followed low, steady, trying to calm her. Keating made another note. You understand that provisional placement is contingent upon the children's well-being, as well as your capacity to maintain an environment conducive to their development. I do, and you're aware that disruption of sibling placement, while unfortunate, may become necessary if individual needs cannot be adequately met within the current arrangement. The words hung in the air like smoke. Disruption. Separation. John didn't realize how tightly he'd been gripping the back of the chair until his knuckles began to ache. They've been through enough, he said. Keating closed the folder. We'll need to conduct a full reassessment. The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. No one spoke as they moved through the house again. The bedrooms were inspected, the kitchen counters checked, the counseling schedule reviewed with quiet efficiency. When it was over, Linda lingered near the door. They're scared, she said gently. So am I. Her eyes softened. I know. Outside, the cold had deepened. John watched their car disappear down the street before closing the door behind him. The lock clicked into place with a finality that felt heavier than it should have. In the living room, 6 pairs of eyes watched him. No one asked what had happened. They didn't need to, because reassessment meant reconsideration, and reconsideration meant that everything, the beds, the drawings, the fragile laughter that had begun to fill the house, could still be taken away. That night, long after the girls had gone to sleep, John sat at the kitchen table with the placement agreement spread open in front of him. Provisional. Temporary. Subject to change. The words blurred together as he stared at them. For the first time since bringing the girls home, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that loving them might not be enough to keep them. And somewhere down the hallway, a floorboard creaked like the house itself wasn't sure how long they'd be staying either.